Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 18 in my series of talks on the history of English detective fiction from 1920 to about 1960. Thank you for being there. Tonight I'm going to talk about one of the masters of the craft, Cyril Hare. But first, 2 or 3 items of news. I'm recording this talk on the day of breaking news. Mrs. White, for 70 years, Dr. Black's pastry cook in Tudor Court, has been killed off by the makers of Cluedo. You may remember we included Cluedo as episode 11 in this series of talks. We can now say that Mrs. White has been replaced by another female character, Dr. Orchid, who is a specialist in toxicology. The poisonous element is increased. 2 customers in my bookshop were discussing how the game's originator would have felt about that. You know, I think that Anthony Pratt would have been chuffed to bits that people are prepared to invest in his ideas after all these years. Now, there's been some mention that the early episodes in this series are difficult to find as they've been deleted from some of the hosting sites, so I'm working on bringing together the first, say, 6 or 8 episodes and posting them as an omnibus. That should be up and running in the next few weeks. I'm very busy at the moment, but please keep an eye on the website for news. That's malcolmnoble.com. A couple of more items for the notice board. Thanks to all the ideas that are coming through, there's a notion that I should begin each episode by mentioning the book that I'm reading at the moment. Not sure that fits into the history of English detective fiction. However, at the moment I'm enjoying Murder in the Museum by John Rowland. He's an author I like, and my copy is a paperback from the series of the British Library Crime Classics, a reprint list which, as you can imagine, suits me very nicely, thank you. Now, before we get started, just want to mention another suggestion that I should devote one episode to a survey of reference books about the history of English detective fiction. Now, I've chatted with a couple of listeners about how to take that forward without it getting in the way of the usual progress of the series. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to recommend one reference book from my shelf at the end of every podcast. Okay, let's talk about Cyril Hare. That's a pseudonym for a county court judge who wrote 8 detective novels and at least 30 stories from 1937 to 1958. He was born in 1900 to a well-to-do family of wine merchants. Educated at Rugby School, he also went to Oxford University where he got a first in history. And apparently, while he was there, he listened to the legendary Dr. Spooner, him of the Spoonerisms. Well, that's a Strand gory if ever I heard one. He was called to the bar, married into the well-connected Lewisham family, and before long was contributing small paragraphs to the magazine Punch. Now, Michael Gilbert, another crime writer who eventually edited Hare's collection of short stories posthumously, called these pieces flippant. But in 1937, Cyril Hare published his first novel, Tenant for Death. Incidentally, Hare's advance for that first novel was £25. By the end of his career, he would be receiving 20 times that much. Now, if you listen to previous episodes of my podcast, you'll have picked up that Hare was beginning to write his detective novels at that period when the conventions of the detective story and the expectations of the readers had developed to such a degree that many writers were wondering if they could actually write their best within the genre. Hare was one of those authors who bridged that period and took up the challenge of exploring detective stories into their post-war publishing environment, and he did it very successfully. So what was the trick? Well, he was a master of the craft. He produced sensible puzzles that worked out. He delivered it in a literate style and with that important element, humour and wit. He certainly didn't give the impression that he thought he was writing lesser fiction because he was writing detective stories. He very obviously enjoys writing the genre, and that comes through. Also, he liked his detectives. He didn't allow himself to draw on them beyond their sell-by date, so he didn't become bored with them in the way that other writers did. He based his novels on things that interested him, not only points and tricks of law, not only familiar localities around Surrey and Guildford, which was where he lived and worked, but also odd bits of interests, like what it was like to lodge in a boarding house during World War II, hunting, shooting and fishing, and the semi-professional orchestra. All these things formed the basis and background for one of Hare's books. Perhaps I have two criticisms of him. Sometimes the humour is such that you feel that he is talking to his own circle, and if we're not on the inside, then perhaps we're not in on the joke. And his titles sometimes give away too much of the story, but hey, these are very small grumbles when we compare them to the quality of his writing. So let's look at that quality. And I'd like to read you now an excerpt from Michael Gilbert's introduction to the best stories of Cyril Hare. This is what Gilbert had to say. Some writers are difficult to read even when they write well. Others are easy to read at all times. To call it a matter of style is to beg the question. I should prefer to call it a matter of voice. Cyril Hare had a most attractive speaking voice. Even his bad short stories are most readable, from the smoothness and technique with which they are presented. It is a technique which must have derived a good deal from the profession of advocacy. To my mind, Cyril Hare had very few equals at this. His careful training in full-length detective novels, where the incautious giving away of a single clue may jeopardise the whole work, had undoubtedly trained him in this aspect of his craft. Michael Gilbert was focusing on Cyril Hare's short stories in that extract, and the short stories are rightly celebrated. Many people say that the best Cyril Hare stories are the best short stories in the genre, but I wouldn't want them to overshadow the quality of the full-length novels. Now, in my YouTube series, Crime Fiction Classics, I reviewed With a Bear Bodkin, and I'd just like to play you the soundtrack of that review now as an example of a Cyril Hare book. Hello there, Malcolm Noble with my weekly talk about a crime fiction classic. Today I've chosen my favourite detective writer of the moment, Cyril Hare. It's very difficult to choose just one of his novels, but I've decided to go with a personal favourite, With a Bear Bodkin, and present it to you as a crime fiction classic. He published the novel in 1946, just after the Second World War. Francis Pettigrew, the unsuccessful barrister in most of Cyril Hare's stories, is bombed out during the Blitz and has to take a civil service job in the north of England. Cyril Hare's picture of the English civil service is just right, with its hierarchies and bureaucracies and the little in-house conventions. That alone would make this a classic, but he also amuses us with a delightful picture of an English boarding house. That's where the investigators, and maybe the suspects, come together. Cyril Hare, who was a county court judge, is a wonderful observer of character. Cyril Hare has long been a favourite of the fans of the English detective story, but I would also recommend With a Bear Bodkin to anyone who wants a quiet, light read. So after your supper this evening, settle down in the armchair and enjoy a couple of hours with Cyril Hare's lovely writing. Don't forget to order the hot cocoa. I also need to mention his short stories, because Cyril Hare has a tremendous reputation as one of the best English detective short story writers. As I said, it's very difficult to choose just one Cyril Hare novel as standing out from the others. Many people, most people in fact, might have gone for Tenant for Death. When the Wind Blows is another good one, and one of my other favourites, He Should Have Died Hereafter. Very good cluing in that one. But I chose With a Bear Bodkin as this week's crime fiction classic. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoy it. Please let me know your comments, and I'll see you again. Now, I'd like to follow that extract with another reading from Michael Gilbert's introduction to the best stories of Cyril Hare. Here, I think Gilbert gets to the very essence of Cyril Hare's talent. This is what he had to say. A large number of the stories are told in the first person. There is little doubt about it. The narrator is Cyril Hare himself, standing, as I have so often seen him stand, in the front of the fireplace at Kingly Street, hands in pockets, head thrust forward, or prostrate in one of the unspeakable leather armchairs, demonstrating to his hearers that law and life, humanity and inhumanity, probability and improbability, were alike grist to one careful observer's mill. And now I'd like to read an extract from He Should Have Died Hereafter by Cyril Hare as an example of his observation of character. The holiday had been Eleanor's idea in the first place. Holidays, for Francis Pettigrew, signified first and foremost strange beds, and a strange bed meant, for the first night at least, waking up in the small hours instead of sleeping through till dawn. Nonetheless, as he lay wakefully watching the shifting pattern of moon shadows on the wall, he was prepared to concede that it was an excellent idea. Nowadays, he acknowledged, not without shame, it would be difficult to find any departure from the monotony of their rather humdrum joint existence, which was not due to an idea of Eleanor's. More and more with advancing years, he had tended to resign the initiative in his affairs to his still young wife. It made for peace, and so far he had had no reason to regret it. During World War II, Cyril Hare contracted TB, and he wasn't well for the last few years of his life. He died in 1958 of TB, having fallen ill during a visit to France. It was a great loss because he clearly had a lot more writing to do. As it is, he's left us with 8 novels and over 30 short stories. And as a body of work, the books provide an answer to those people who said that with the development of the crime novel in the post-war years, detective fiction was nothing more than a novelty. That is not the case with the work of Cyril Hare. Now, as promised, a recommendation from my library shelf of reference books related to crime fiction, and this week it is a very personal favourite. I love this book, The Mystery Lover's Book of Quotations by Jane Horning. It is what it says, and it includes 3 quotations by Cyril Hare. Please don't pass it by if you have the chance to pick up a copy. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to episode 18 in my series of talks on the history of English detective fiction. My name is Malcolm Noble. My website is malcolmnoble.com. I hope you'll take a look at it. The podcast page on that website includes a list of previous episodes with links if you wish to catch up. I need to thank Freeze Effects for the royalty-free music. I posted this podcast on the 10th of July, 5 days late, and I'm sorry about that. And I plan to upload the next episode on the 24th of the month. I hope you'll be there to listen. In the meantime, all that remains is for me to wish you a good night, and God bless.